So we'll have a circle of prayer over there before we eat. All right, you don't have to stand today because I've got several passages I want to read before I start this message today. The title of my message is "The Lifted is the Lifter." The lifted is the lifter. Lifter being Christ, the lifted being us. And the theme of this message today has to do with how the Lord will lift us out of terrible storms that comes to our life. And we're going to talk about those things later on. But turn with Isaiah the 29th chapter, if you would. Isaiah the 29th chapter. I'm already there. Isaiah the 29th chapter. And I want to read the 6th verse. Now I want you to listen to this verse as I read it. Don't just look at it and go on and don't listen. Listen to this verse as I read it. He says, "Thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts with what? With thunder, with earthquake, great noise, with storm and tempest, and the flame of devouring fire." Now, you go ahead and blame things. You go ahead and blame your troubles on Satan if you want to. But the Lord let them know that He's going to visit them with these very things right here. And I can take you back. I'm not going back to. I can take you back to the book of Exodus, where the Lord told the children of Israel, yes, He's going to visit the Egyptians, but He's also going to visit you too. And that's exactly, you'll say, that's where the Bible, when it says it rains on the just and the unjust, that's what it means. It rains on the just and the unjust. The Lord visits His children, and He's visiting us. That's the reason I said let's celebrate this hurricane today as we eat, because let's celebrate that the Lord's going to visit us. And that's a wonderful thing. When the Lord knocks on the door, you better answer it, because He's going to visit us. And Isaiah 28 and verse 2, back a couple of pages in your Bible. Isaiah 28 and verse 2, he says, "Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand." That is, with just waving of the hand of the Lord, He can cover this whole area with water. He can do it if He wants to. I heard someone say, well, we don't have to worry about getting flooded out because we live up higher. Well, don't underestimate what God can do. That's what He says there. He says, I can do it with just the raising of my hand. I can send all of this up on you. Also in Isaiah 25, back in Isaiah 25 and verse 4. Isaiah 25 and verse 4, "For thou hast been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in his distress, a refuge from the storm, a shadow from the heat, when the blast of the terrible ones is a storm against the wall." Let me tell you something, folks. 1974, we had numerous tornadoes came through area up there, Cynthiana. They wound up being close to 500 and some people was killed across the river in Ohio, and of course where we were up there in Cincinnati wasn't too far from the Ohio River. Across the Ohio River over in Ohio people were killed. People were killed, and right there Brandenburg, Kentucky was blown off of the map with tornadoes, and the whole city was destroyed, and there was 100 and some people killed in that one city right there that one night. And let me tell you, folks, we stayed in the basement of the church. We had a basement, and the fireman came by, and he was an excluded member. The fireman that came by the church, he came by the parsonage, and he was an excluded member, and he said, "Preacher," he said, "get your family in the basement," because he said, "We've done had 2 tornadoes went through, just south of us here, and said, we got more coming. Said, get your family in the basement. And I took the family to the basement. We stayed in the basement church till 4 o'clock in the morning. And we went back over to the parsonage. And so we got word on the radio that there's another tornado headed towards Cynthiana. After we went back up, we thought it was all over. And I put Rhonda and the kids under the bed. And I sat in between the bed and the wall with my back to the wall. When that tornado went over, I could feel that wall pushing against my back. That's how powerful it was. That's what he says here. Well, he says here, for thou hast been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy and distressed, a refuge from the storm, a shadow from the heat, when the blast of the terrible ones is as a storm against the wall. You know, let me tell you something, folks. The Lord is able to send a lot of things, so don't go around saying just because something terrible happens, it's the devil that did it. You don't quit that, because you're blaspheming God when you do that. And I'm sorry, it's what you're doing. You're blaspheming the Lord. I was criticized for saying that back several years ago. But I want to tell you, you're blaspheming God when you say that. Because I'm telling you, as I've said before, God cannot do anything. I mean, the devil cannot do anything that God won't let him do. He can't do a thing that what God won't let him do. And so let's quit all that, and let's realize that this storm that's coming is sent here. It's sent here by God, and it's sent here for a reason. You might say, well, we've never been through anything like that. And maybe why it's sent. And maybe why God is sending it here. Because, you know, I said this a few years back. One of the problems we have right here at Landmark Baptist Church, there hadn't been enough persecution. There hadn't been enough things, but here in what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, there's a lot has come. A lot has come our way. And if it didn't humble you down, then you can't be humbled down. If you don't realize how powerful God is and what God can do, then you just don't know God. You don't know the same God I know. Jesus. But when we can be thankful for it, that Jesus is the lifter who must be lifted up. You know, it said, how many of you have found yourself really cast down, feeling there is never any hope of ever being lifted from your despair? And may I say, how many of you are a little antsy about the storm? I mean, you're a little antsy about the storm, you know. Rhonda's been kind of antsy about the storm, and I told her, I said, Rhonda, just realize God's going to take care of us. God's going to take care of it. And she's not the only one. There's others. There's a lot of others that are just antsy about the storm. But God's going to take care of us. I believe that. I really believe that. I know it would be a great lifting up for all of us if we have a time or two. If we had a time or two when we found ourselves in need of being lifted up. I do believe that there would be a greater desire to serve the Lord when the Lord brings you out of the despair of a great storm in your life. There's a greater respect for Him whom you didn't know before the despair hit it. Oh, no. No, we're just thankful the devil left us. Yeah, we just think the devil doesn't go on living our lives like we always lived it. We're just thankful the devil let us alone. I've even said this myself, and I admit it, but I've asked forgiveness for it many times over the years. I've even said it, that periodically the devil will lift his head. But I've since learned that it is God that will send these things upon us to try our faith, to see what we are. He's trying our faith today, trying your faith right now. I can't change what's going to happen. There ain't no way I could pray from now until tomorrow night, and it's not going to change one thing about what's going to happen. Because God's going to send it, it's going to come, and it's going to do whatever it's going to do, and it's going to leave on God's beckoning. You know, there was no way in this world, they were saying that on TV this morning, there was no way, no thought, ever a thought that Atlanta would have an impact from this storm. But they're going to. They got people in Atlanta right now preparing for a hurricane storm. They got people in Tennessee, in Nashville, Tennessee, that's preparing for a storm. You got people in parts of Kentucky that's preparing for a storm. Let me tell you, God can work us over when He sees fit to do so. But what a wonderful thing when God lifts us up out of it, sets us up on that solid rock, and we watch the waters and the thundering and the lightning of the storm go by, that we can say, Lord, we're so thankful that you took care of us. God, how can I thank you enough? How can I be thankful enough? God, I'm going to be so thankful this Sunday I'm not going to go to church. You know, just to think, you know, we've got a storm coming, but how many people didn't go to church today? How much faith is that? I'm serious, folks. How much faith is that? Man, you ought to be running to the Lord's house. You as a child of God ought to be running to the Lord's house. You might say, no, I have to stay home and take care of my stuff. You ought to be running to the Lord's house. You ought to be thankful to have been here for 2 services today. Those of you that were here for Sunday school and those of you that are here now, you were here for 2 services today in this church. And you ought to be thankful when God lifts you up out of this storm. When the Lord brings you out of despair of a great storm in your life, there's a greater respect for Him whom you didn't know before the despair hit. You didn't know that it was God that was trying us. It is a wonderful blessing to know at the times of casting down, when our characters are almost dismantled at the hands of the wicked and merciless people, there's great hope of being lifted up by the great God who loves us with an everlasting love. It doesn't make any difference what it is. This world is not good to Christians. It is not. You might say, oh, I know of a lot of good people that are good to Christians. Let me tell you, this world's not good to Christians. I had a man tell me here a while back, I can tell you who the man is. Reggie and Carmen know him well. I had a man tell me here a while back. He said, since I started hanging around you, and I call you Brother Paul, he said, I've had more people who have told me that I don't need to hang around you that much. He said, it came from my own church. Now let me tell you something, folks. He even asked his church to have me to preach a revival for him. And that's when he was told he need to quit hanging around me. Let me tell you something, folks. This world doesn't have much to offer to God's children. Very little. We can say, as our brother Job said, there is a lifting up. When Job was put in the condition he was in, all Job said was, he said, there is a lifting up. In other words, there is a time going to come when God's going to lift us up. I tell you, He may not take us to heaven this week or tomorrow or tonight, but there's a time going to come when He's going to lift us up. He's going to lift us up. Let's think about the time when there was a time when we longed to be lifted up. Look at Luke 13, if you would, for just a moment. Luke 13. I want to read something to you here. In Luke 13 and verse 11, he says, and behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift up herself. no wise lift up herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. Immediately she was standing up. What about the man down there by the fountain, down there waiting on the water to move at Bethesda? Waiting on the water to move. He was laying there. He'd been 38 years. He'd been sick. 38 years they'd been carrying him out to that edge of that water. And he was waiting on the water to move. And he told Jesus, he says, I'm waiting on the water to move. And he said, I believe if I get down there and somebody will put me in the water, when the water's moving, he says, I'll be healed. And Jesus told him, says, stand up, take up thy bed and walk. You don't need to go to that water. You don't need to go to water to be healed. Just like you don't need to go in this baptismal water to be healed, because it's not going to heal you. Jesus lifted him up. The Bible says that he took up his bed and he walked. Took up his bed and he walked. Jesus told him, said, take up thy bed and walk. And he took up his bed and walked. Lifted up. He was lifted up. He was waiting on the water to lift him up. Jesus lifted him up. Let me tell you, folks, the lifted is the lifter. You'll say, what do you mean by that? Well, Jesus was lifted. We're going to talk about that in just a little while. The poor woman was so bowed together that there was no way she could lift herself. I found myself in that condition one day. I found out that I was lost, and there was no way I could get up and find my way out of the terrible condition. I was in miry pile of clay. Pit of clay. And because of sin, I was stuck there. I was so bowed together by the stench of the world that I could in no wise lift myself out of it. Like the hated publican, I could not so much as lift up my head and mine eyes toward heaven. If you're saved today, you too were also in the same condition. Can you remember it? You were in the same condition. When you couldn't lift yourself up, you couldn't do a thing for yourself. If not, then you may need really to be lifted from your sin today. Let's also think about there's a lifter who lifts. It was the psalmist who said, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of my head. Listen, folks, when the head is lifted above the flood, the life is saved. When the head is lifted above the flood, the life is saved. Each of us, in our overwhelming helplessness and mighty guilt of sin, needs such lifting as can only be accomplished by the mercy and love of Christ himself. And again, the psalmist says, and now shall my head be lifted up above mine enemies round about me. Therefore I will offer in his tabernacle sacrifices of joy. I will sing, yea, I will sing praises unto the Lord. The psalmist said, he lifted me up, and now I'm going to sing praises unto him. I'm not going to go and get drunk after tomorrow. When everything's out of it, I'm not going to be so happy that I'm going to get drunk. I'm not going to be so happy that I'm going to go and do something I shouldn't do. You know, that's why I say, let's celebrate this storm today. Let's celebrate Family Day, but let's celebrate this storm today too. That God is sending our way. God is sending our way for a reason. Now let's think about, there is the love of the lifter. Here it is. This is the title of our message. The title of our message, you'll say, what do you mean by the title of this message? The title of the message is The Lifted. The lifted is the lifter. Listen to this. Jesus said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me. John 12 and verse 32. He's the lifted, but he's also the lifter. Because Jesus was lifted up, then I have hope of being lifted up. Because he's the lifter. Jesus was lifted up so he could be the lifter. You see, so this storm right here don't mean a thing to God. It doesn't mean a thing to God. You'll say, well, why does God do it? That storm doesn't mean a thing to God. Did you see the words of the first song that we sang this morning before Sunday school? You should go back and read William Gadsby's song that we sang. That song was written in sometime in the 1700s. And what he said, Jesus is the lifted up, and he's also the lifter. Of course, he's speaking about all the elect when he says, I will draw all men unto me. He said, I'll draw my children unto me. The almighty lifter had himself lifted up on the tree, lifted up from the grave, lifted to the throne of his Father. Isaiah said he saw him high and lifted up. Isaiah said, I saw him high and lifted up. Well, how do you see him today? Do you see him high and lifted up today? Or do you just see him for somebody that you can tell people you believe? Do you really see him high and lifted up? That's what Isaiah did. All this was done that he may be the lifter of all of his elected children. It was a psalmist who said, Thou hast in love to my soul delivered it from the pit of corruption. He's lifted him up. He lifted him up from the pit of corruption. He lifted me up from the pit of corruption. If you're saved today, he lifted you up from the pit of corruption. If you're saved today, he'll be lifting you up from the pit of corruption. But that doesn't end right there, because you're corrupted to start with. And it's very easy to get back in that pit of corruption. But he'll lift you out of it today. If you haven't been living as you should be living, you need to realize that he can lift you up out of it. He can lift you up out of that. You know, if you've been living your life to the point to where you don't know which way to turn, he can lift you up out of that. Believe me, he can do it. And lastly, we must hear that there is lauding of the lifter. There is the lauding of the lifted. That's it, those that have been lifted up, you and me. We've been lifted up. The psalmist says, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he hath redeemed from the hand of the enemy. How many of you go out there and let your families know that you're redeemed? You've been redeemed. How many let them know? How many of them, when they start talking about your pastor, you'll say, but I've been redeemed. They won't know why you follow him, why you believe it. I know you'll say, well, I don't know. Yeah, I do. I know. I know some of you have been questioned about those things. Why couldn't you look them right straight in the eye and say, I've been redeemed? I've been lifted up. It's not Brother Paul. I've been lifted up. I've been redeemed. There are some awesome declarations from some of God's wonderful saints. Job says, then thou shalt have the delight in the Almighty, and shall lift up thy face unto God. Job, well, the man that went through what he went through. He said, then thou shalt have the delighted, have delight in the Almighty, and shall lift up thy face unto God. How in the world could Job, from a pit, from a garbage dump, where he is rolling around naked, no clothes on, taking pieces of potsherd and clay, hard clay, and scraping the boils and everything, trying to get the cores out of them, all over his body, rolling around in the ash pile. I told this a long time ago, us boys would get cut. My dad didn't go and get antiseptic. We didn't have any. My dad didn't go and pick up anything and get it for it, didn't get any tape. We didn't have any. My dad didn't get a Band-Aid. We didn't know what it was. You know what my dad did? He'd go in there to that old potbelly stove. He'd get a handful of them ashes out, and he'd put them all over that. Doctors today would cringe if you told them that. But it'd get well. It'd get well. They had some healing power. You say, why did Job go to the ash pit? Because Job knew that there was healing power there. Let me tell you, folks, when you get down in the ash pile, you know there's healing power, because Jesus is going to lift you up out of it. Jesus is going to lift you up out of it. I had this stuff all over my face when I came back from the doctor. They had a big old bandage on me and everything. And man said, don't let it get dirty. I can imagine if I'd have told that nurse, I'm going home and put some ashes on it. She said, no, don't do nothing like that. Let me tell you, God uses a lot of things out there. Us kids that get sick, we get a sore throat. My dad would head for the mountains. He'd bring back ginseng, sassafras, all kinds of roots. Mom would put them on the stove and she'd boil them and she'd make a tea. And you'll say, well, how did it taste? That's the reason your sore throat went away. That's the reason it helped your sore throat. Dad knew what to go get. Man couldn't read and write, but he knew what to go in them mountains and get, and have Mom boil it up and make us a tea. That's all we took. We didn't go to the doctor. We had no doctor. God will lift you up. God has ways. God has provided things right here on this earth so that we can be lifted up. Just like this storm that's coming. Well, there's a reason why there's thunder from heaven. There's a reason why there's storms that come down from heaven. There's a reason why. Some people laugh when I say that in my marriage ceremony. When I say this marriage is made in heaven, just remember that's where thunder and lightning comes from too. You know, just saying that is not going to make a marriage. God has to make a marriage. And God has to keep it together. God has to keep it right there. Isaiah said, thou shalt lift their voice. They shall sing. They shall cry aloud. Isaiah 24:14. They shall lift their voice unto God. What more can we do but lift our voice unto God? Jesus himself said, lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Tomorrow be a good day to be looking at that eastern sky. Tomorrow be a good day for looking this way and seeing if the Lord's going to come back during the storm. What's the first thing Peter saw when he was sinking in the storm, in the tempest of the sea? He looked up. Who did he see? Jesus. Jesus right there. Jesus took him up and said, "O ye of little faith." Don't let that happen to you tomorrow. Don't let that happen to you. Don't let it happen to you that God will say to you, "O ye of little faith." You know, I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. I'd love to preach this message to all of South Texas. I'd love to preach this message to all of Florida. I'd go down there in the storm and preach it if they'd let me. Of course, it'd be like everywhere else. There'd be enough people down there to listen to it. But let me tell you, folks, God will lift us up. And I'm going to end this with a question. How much lauding do I hear today? How much do I hear today? How much praising God do I hear today? You're forcing to get an amen. You're forcing to get a head shake. Let me tell you, in this day and time, you're forcing it. All right, let's all stand if you would, and we're going to dismiss in prayer here, but don't